चलो भोर के राही, ओ हम राही, तुम्हें है चलना। चलो भोर के राही, ओ हम राही, तुम्हें है चलना। चलो भोर के राही, ओ हम राही, तुम्हें है चलना। चलो भोर के राही, ओ हम राही, तुम्हें है चलना। है कठिन डगर चलो तुम मगर, है हजारों गम न करो फिकर। तेरी राह का कण कण बनेगा कंचन के एक दिन देखना। चलो भोर के राही, ओ हम राही, तुम्हें है चलना। क्यों उदास हो है दुखी ये मन, क्यों दुखी ये मन है थके चरण। चलो लेके मन में आस, नए विश्वास की शुभ कामना। चलो भोर के राही, ओ हम राही, तुम्हें है चलना। आह्वान सुनो आह्वान, जागे नव प्राण है सपने। मिलकर चलो मिलकर मेरे साथी मेरे अपने। आह्वान सुनो आह्वान, जागे नव प्राण ये सपने। मिलकर चलो मिलकर मेरे साथी मेरे अपने। चुनकर नव युग की नई किरणें, अब नई जोत जगे हर घर में। यात्रा नए हलचल नए अरमान नई अग्नि। अंबर नया अंबर नई धरती सजे अपनी। यात्रा नए हलचल नए अरमान नई अग्नि। अंबर नया अंबर नई धरती सजी अपनी। जो झूमे अधरों पे मुस्कान आई है, हमने वो पाई है करके बलिदान। आह्वान सुनो आह्वान, जागे नव प्राण है सपने। मिलकर चलो मिलकर मेरे साथी मेरे अपने। आह्वान सुनो आह्वान, जागे नव प्राण ये सपने। मिलकर चलो मिलकर मेरे साथी मेरे अपने। चलो भोर के राही, ओ हम राही, तुम्हें है चलना। चलो भोर के राही, ओ हम राही, तुम्हें है चलना। न रुको अगर रोके तुम्हें पथ पे कोई छलना। न रुको अगर रोके तुम्हें पथ पे कोई छलना। चलो भोर के राही, ओ हम राही। चलो भोर के राही, ओ हम राही, ओ हम राही।
Namaste, my dear brothers and sisters. Love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram Delhi branch. This inspirational song in the melodious voice of Mithu was about optimism, confidence, and the traveler, traveler, on the journey of life, was be given that confidence that in spite of all the difficulties and sorrows that you have, don't lose hope, have faith, have trust in the divine, and continue. The traveler was called Bhor Ke Rahi, that is the traveler of the dawn. So dawn signifies optimism. It gives us the hope that the brighter day is going to follow. It also gives us trust that after every night, unfailingly, we have that dawn, which gives us this hope. So no matter how dark the night, the bright light will eventually return. So dawn gives us and reinforces that type of a hope day after day. Turning to today's subject, the higher functions of the brain. The higher we go, the less we know. Because as we go to the higher functions, they get more complex, more intangible, and we enter areas which are on the borderline of physiology and psychology. What we shall do today is talk mainly about two things. One is sleep, and the other is learning. And again, not everything about these two, particularly learning is an extremely broad subject, and we shall touch upon only two of the well-known experimental paradigms that have been used to study some basic elements of the process of learning. So with that, I turn to the PowerPoint. And the session is a part of the S.03 course on health sciences and yoga. And this course is a part of the YES project, the Yoga Education and Spirituality project, which in turn is a part of the 150th birth anniversary celebrations of Sri Aurobindo and the 75th anniversary of India's independence. The anatomical pictures in this presentation have been taken from Tortora and Grabowski's Principles of Anatomy and Physiology. Let me start with the electroencephalogram or the EEG, because the understanding of sleep was gained largely through these EEG studies on subjects who were awake and asleep. Electroencephalogram is the electrical activity recorded from the surface of the head. What we do is place electrodes on the scalp, the head, the surface of the head, and record the electrical activity, something like the way we record an electrocardiogram from the chest, the electrical activity of the heart. And what we record is the activity of large groups of nerve cells. And if this activity is synchronized, then we get large waves. Whereas when it is not synchronized, uh, the some positive waves cancel out the negative waves, and the result is actually the frequency goes up, but the amplitude goes down. We get smaller waves at a faster frequency when there is more activity. So this is what is paradoxical, that larger waves do not really signify greater activity. They signify a lower level of activity, which is synchronous, whereas smaller waves signify much more activity, which is not synchronous, because a very large number of nerve cells active simultaneously and their activity is not strictly synchronized. These are two basic rhythms of the awake state, the alpha and the beta rhythm. The alpha rhythm is the rhythm of being awake but inattentive, and usually obtained when the person is awake, inattentive, and has his eyes closed. Because as you can see in this picture, the moment the person opens the eyes, the rhythm changes from alpha to beta. Alpha has larger waves, bigger waves, waves with a greater amplitude, and a little less frequent. The beta waves have a smaller amplitude and are more frequent. That's because when the eyes are opened, the person looks around, his attention is directed to the things around, and that's what disturbs the alpha rhythm and brings about beta rhythm. This can be done also, this alpha rhythm can be disturbed by any type of stimulus, even if the person's eyes remain closed and we just clap, the alpha rhythm will be disturbed by the sound. If we touch him with with something which is a little cold or warm, even that will disturb the alpha rhythm. It has been seen that in studies on accomplished yogis, that to some extent, this type of change does not happen so easily. Uh, they have alpha rhythm, and if you clap or touch them with a hot or cold object, very often the alpha rhythm still continues, which means that they are able to maintain this relative inattentiveness, or they refuse to get involved in it. They don't get startled by a stimulus, and sort of that basic stability of mind that they have gets reflected in the alpha rhythm persisting even after we have given some such stimulus. Now, this is the now this is the electrocardiogram as it sorry, electroencephalogram, or the EEG, as it evolves from the awake to the sleep state. So this is the awake state, the eyes closed, and we have the alpha rhythm. Then here the person has opened the eyes, or something else has distracted the person, and we have this beta rhythm here. Now suppose this person starts going to sleep. Then initially what happens is that the rhythm shows very little change, but all the same there is a change. There's a reduction in the amplitude here, a little reduction in frequency, and the person has started feeling drowsy. Then as the sleep progresses, we get what are called, sleep spindles. That is, these repeated waves, which are low in frequency, high in amplitude, and this is what we call the stage 2 sleep. And then we find that gradually the height of these waves goes up, the frequency goes down, and then still further, there is a further increase in the height of these waves and a still further reduction in the frequency. So these two, where there's a clear reduction in the frequency and an increase in the height, are stage 3 and 4. And the stage 4 rhythm is what is called the delta rhythm. Now, in stage 1 and 2, the person is uh, in light sleep, can be woken up easily. But in stage 3 and 4, the person is in deep sleep, more difficult to wake up the person. So it takes about an hour to pass from stage 1 and 2 to stage 3 and 4. And initially, when a person sleeps, this whole thing may go on from stage 1 to stage 4, may take about 3 to 4 hours. And this type of sleep is called slow wave sleep, because these waves are slow. Now, after the person has been sleeping for 3 to 4 hours and has progressed from stage 1 to stage 4, initially in stage 1 and 2 light sleep, and stage 3 and 4 deep sleep, when it's very difficult to wake up the person, after the person has gone through this, then suddenly something dramatic happens. About an hour after the person has been in stage 3 and 4, something dramatic happens, and the waves suddenly become low in their height, their amplitude, and high in frequency, very similar to what we have in the beta rhythm. But the person is asleep. And that's why this phase of sleep is also called paradoxical sleep. Paradoxical because the person is asleep, but the brain seems just as active and has the same type of EEG as in the awake and attentive state, the beta rhythm. Now, this is the phase during which the person is dreaming. So this is dream sleep. Slow wave sleep is a non-dream sleep. It's non-dream and The waves are slow, slow wave sleep. This is dream sleep. REM sleep is dream sleep. And uh, during this phase, if we record electrical activity of the eye muscles, what is called the electrooculogram, we find that the eyes are also moving. So the eyelids are closed, but inside the eyeballs are moving as if they are tracing some object. Probably the objects seen in the dream, the way we would in the awake state. So the eyes are moving, and the brain is apparently very active. Uh, it also shows up in the blood flow to the brain. The blood flow increases in certain parts of the brain, and the overall metabolism of the brain goes up by 20%, which is in contrast with what happens in the slow wave sleep, where in fact it goes down. So, slow wave sleep is a hypometabolic state. The person gradually starts consuming less and less oxygen. The brain also starts consuming less oxygen, and the person as a whole is dominated by the parasympathetic overactivity, reduction in heart rate, reduction in the respiratory rate, the and so on. So the person is moving towards a inactive state in slow wave sleep, but then suddenly the activity changes. The person is still asleep, but the brain shows signs of greater activity, the metabolism goes up, the eyes start moving. And if you wake up a person during this phase, the person always reports a dream. Now, this alternation of slow wave sleep and REM sleep, the rapid eye movement sleep, it's called REM sleep, rapid eye movement. REM sleep or dream sleep is alternation between non-dream sleep or slow wave sleep and REM sleep or dream sleep. This alternation goes on 5 to 7 times every night. But after the first cycle, during which a slow wave sleep may be 3 to 4 hours and this REM sleep maybe half an hour or less, gradually what happens is the cycle becomes more frequent. The slow wave sleep uh, occupies, and the alternation between the slow wave sleep and the REM sleep becomes more frequent, and the slow wave sleep occupies less and less time. More time is spent on REM sleep. So that by the time the person wakes up in the morning, the person wakes up usually immediately after going through a cycle of REM sleep, which means the person has dreamt something just before getting up, and this is the dream that we remember. The rest of the dreams are forgotten. And sometimes even this last dream may not be remembered. And then the person says that I had a very sound, dreamless sleep. But it has been found on several subjects, hundreds of subjects, that everybody actually dreams, although the person may not remember the dream. So we go through this alternation of dreamless sleep and dream sleep every night. So to start with, we have slow wave sleep, and then the person passes into REM sleep or dream sleep. Uh, this is also called paradoxical sleep because the EEG is similar to that of the awake and active state, awake and attentive state, awake and alert state, but the person is actually fast asleep. And the cycle is repeated 5 to 7 times every night. And in successive cycles, that is alternation of non-dream sleep and dream sleep, in this in these cycles, the slow wave sleep gets shorter and less deep because it becomes more and more confined to stage 1 and 2, and the REM sleep or the dream sleep becomes longer in that cycle. And before waking up, usually the person goes through a phase of REM sleep, a bout of REM sleep. The person dreams. We find a great variation with age in the duration and character of the sleep. The duration declines during childhood and youth and stabilizes at the age of about 30. It may decline again uh, and become biphasic after age 60, which means that the person starts sleeping twice a day, sometime part of the time during the an hour or two in the day and the rest of the sleep at night. So the duration of the night sleep may go down again, but this is made up by sleeping during the day, and the two together are still more or less the same as after age 30. So this is the change. But then this doesn't always happen. Some people continue to have 7 to 8 hours of sleep or more, even in old age, and they may not need much sleep during the daytime. But this is quite a characteristic pattern. Further, what is very important is that in the elderly, the slow wave sleep or the non-dream sleep is mostly stage 1 and 2. Stage 1 and 2, when the waves are still quite small and frequent, and the person is only in light sleep, which means that in the elderly, when the person is in slow wave sleep, the person is still in light sleep. The person does not go into a deep sleep. Then the duration of REM sleep does not change much in old age. There may be some reduction, but as a percentage of the duration that the person sleeps, the percentage remains more or less constant. Uh, it remains at about 20% in adults. Let's take up a question which can be easily answered from what we've talked. Why is it more difficult to wake up a young person than an elderly person? And why is it more difficult to wake up a person during the first half of sleep than the second half? That's because a young person uh, goes into, when the person starts going to sleep, spends quite some time in stage 3 and 4 slow wave sleep, from which it's very difficult to wake up the person. So therefore, it's more difficult. Whereas in an elderly person, the phase of slow wave sleep is spent mostly in stage 1 and 2, which is light sleep, from which the person can be easily woken up. And therefore, it's more difficult to wake up a young person than to wake up an elderly person. Then why is it more difficult to wake up even a young person during the first half of sleep than in the second half? Because in the first half, quite a bit of time is spent in the stage 3 and 4 sleep, whereas in the second half, the alternation is more frequent. And secondly, the person also is, during when the person is in slow wave sleep, more time is being spent on stage 1 and 2 than on 3 and 4. So that's why the person is the person gets the deepest sleep, from which it's most difficult to get up when the person is young and in the first half of the sleep during the first few hours. So it's more difficult to wake up a young person because a young person spends considerable time in stage 3 and 4 slow wave sleep, which is deep sleep. And it's also more difficult to wake up a person during the first half of sleep than the second, because the duration of stage 3 and 4 slow wave sleep, that is deep dreamless sleep, is maximum in the first half of sleep. Now this shows the variation with age in REM sleep, the dream sleep. Uh, it seems the fetus, when the fetus is in the mother's womb, has only REM sleep, and therefore spending 100% of the time. So this is the percentage of the total duration. And it seems the fetus is asleep all the time, which means that the fetus is not really awake, it is sleeping, and all the time it is in a state of REM sleep. If a child is born prematurely and 10 weeks premature, it spends 80% of the sleep time is REM sleep. And this newborn is also sleeping most of the time. And just like the fetus, there's only a little short period when the child is awake. If the child is 3 weeks premature, then the percentage of REM sleep, that is percentage of the total duration of sleep, which is spent in REM sleep, is about 60%. In a full-term newborn, it's about 50%. In a young adult, about 20%. And in old age, also about 20%. Now, what this tells us is that there must be something some important function that REM sleep has. And this function is most important in the womb and in the first few years of life. Now, what is it that happens during this phase? One of the things that happens is learning. And this is the phase during which the child is, or the growing fetus is learning something, practicing something, and there is some evidence what it is, and we shall see that in a moment. So now if we look at the functions of the two phases of sleep, the dreamless sleep or the slow wave sleep, and the REM sleep or the dream sleep, uh, both these phases of sleep contribute in some way to consolidation of memory. Now, this is something which had been earlier attributed primarily to REM sleep, but one finds that that division, that slow wave sleep, is only for repair and healing and restoration, and REM sleep is for learning and consolidation of memory. Is not really very strict, and there may be certain types of memory which are consolidated by slow wave sleep, and some other types which are consolidated during dream sleep, or maybe the two phases together cooperate in proper consolidation of memory. But certainly quite a bit of consolidation of memory with which is associated learning happens during sleep. And therefore, it's important for students to understand that they can't uh, sort of really learn properly if they do not sleep properly. It's during sleep that this consolidation of what they learned in the day is taking place. And this happens maximum to what has been learned just before going to bed. And that's why we find that what has been learned just before going to bed is generally very well remembered because of this consolidation happening during sleep. So it quickly passes from short-term memory to long-term memory and gets consolidated, whatever was learned just before sleeping. So these are some of the tricks and bits of uh, knowledge which come in handy, particular to students. And of course, a proper sound sleep also depends upon when we sleep. If we sleep at the time which is in keeping with the normal day and night cycle, or the dark and night cycle, day and night cycle, or the light and dark cycle, then the sleep is much better. The quality of the sleep is much better because associated with the sleep and awake cycle are many other circadian rhythms, that is, rhythms which have about a 24-hour periodicity. And they all have a functional interrelationship. And therefore, um, we get the best of sleep and also a proper functioning of many other parts of the body, be it the gastrointestinal tract or be it in the cardiac function, or uh, we get a better function in all these, or be it the immune system, we get a better function in all these areas. The body as a whole functions better if we do not disturb the synchronicity of this day-night cycle by making sleep completely out of phase with the circadian rhythm. So as far as possible, this should be synchronized with the circadian rhythm, which is tied up to the light and darkness cycle, that is day and night. So consolidation of memory is one of the functions of sleep. Slow wave sleep particularly seems to be important for repair and healing. And that's why we find that if a person is not well, usually the, the person gets up much better because a lot of repair and healing it happens during sleep, particularly slow wave sleep. You know, we have seen that it has more of parasympathetic activity, and it is during that phase of peace, rest, and relaxation that maximum healing is possible. And that's how the person gets up much better. Sleep has been called half the treatment in Ayurveda. It is half the treatment, just sleeping. So this phase of sleep is for essentially for that purpose, the slow wave sleep. Now, about what do we learn during REM sleep? Of course, apart from learning, uh, growth also happens during REM sleep. And perhaps that's one uh, explanation for why the fetus, which is growing at a very fast rate, and the newborn and children, why do they have more of REM sleep? Because they have to grow. And growth happens mostly in REM sleep because of the hormonal changes that are taking place, the secretion of growth hormone, that happens during REM sleep. So the child grows during REM sleep. But then along with that, the person also learns movements. Now, what is the evidence for this? The evidence is that, in sleep, uh, whether it's slow wave sleep or REM sleep, the muscle tone is less. Muscle tone is the state of uh, partial contraction or mild contraction, which is present all the time. And when a person goes to Shavasana, the person makes a voluntary effort to relax. And then the person can get rid of this tone in the muscles, and the person feels extremely relaxed physically. And so relaxed that when the person breathes out and the abdomen goes in, the person gets a feeling of sinking into the mat. Now that happens because the muscle tone is gone. The partial contraction or mild contraction of the muscles, which is present all the time, that is gone. Now that happens in both phases of sleep, but it happens to a greater extent in REM sleep than in the slow wave sleep. Uh, in the REM sleep phase, the muscle tone is even less, it's almost completely gone. So there's no muscle tone. But then there are experimental ways of ensuring that the REM sleep is there, but the muscle tone continues. Those parts of the brain which seem to influence these two separate uh, activities, they can be dissociated, and one can send an animal into the type of REM sleep in which the animal is in REM sleep, but the muscle tone is still quite high. Now, when that we do that, we find that the animal shows uh, complex muscular movements during this phase. If there's no tone, then naturally no movement is possible. But if the tone is gone, this movement becomes possible. And therefore, what it suggests is that the person is actually practicing movements which the child or the person has to learn and perfect, but but is doing it in a safe manner in bed without actually moving the limbs. So without actually moving, it's being rehearsed. And this is something which we are familiar with also in relation to also, I mean, otherwise. Say, for example, a person has just started learning swimming or cycling. Then the person just starts, thinking that this is how I will cycle. The person is not actually cycling or swimming, but the person starts rehearsing the movements uh, just like that. Now, this is actually happening as a part of a normal physiological mechanism during REM sleep. So, what the fetus is doing is to not only grow during the REM sleep, but also practicing some basic movements which it has to perform as soon as it is out of the mother's womb. For example, suckling. So, it is learning those movements during the REM phase of sleep, learning them without actually moving. And when the uh, child has been delivered, this newborn still has a lot of movements to learn. First, how to sit, and then how to crawl, and then how to walk. Though during all these phases, it seems that the child is practicing those movements, and that's why needs more of this REM sleep, sleeps a lot, and a high percentage of the sleep is spent in REM sleep. So it's a sort of, we can call it as type of a bedtime rehearsal or bedroom rehearsal. Just as singers who can't sing too well have a bathroom rehearsal before they actually venture to sing in public, the child is also going through a bedroom rehearsal without actually moving the limbs before the child starts doing it during the daytime. Uh, and since this has been practiced, the entire sequence of events in the nervous system that has got practiced during the REM sleep, the child is less likely to stumble and fall when the child actually practices these movements in the daytime. So a lot of this learning of movement seems to happen during REM sleep. And after the person is an adult, the person does not need this much. And that's why this percentage settles down at about 20%. But then what is this 20% doing? Some consolidation of memory, some learning of movements which are still continuing, like say cycling and swimming and so on. And also, it seems that this is the phase during which the person's creativity may come to the front. Many of the bright ideas uh, have been they have been received during dream sleep. For example, it said that the idea for the structure of the benzene ring, Kekulé got while he was asleep, and probably this happened in a dream. Uh, and there have been many such more instances. Otto Levy, he got the idea for the experiment which led to the discovery of the action of the parasympathetic nerves on the heart. He got the idea of what the sequence of events should be in that experiment. He got it in a dream. And he was so charged with the idea that he got up, went to the laboratory immediately, and started doing that experiment. And overnight, he had made a discovery. So many of such things have happened. So also said that Salvador Dali, the famous painter, the surrealist painter, he used to sleep with a spoon in his hand and keep a plate or something in such a way near the bed so that if the spoon falls, it will fall in that plate and make a noise. Now, that was the time when he woke up, he had some bright idea, and then he would think of sort of make a sketch or something of the painting so that that idea is not lost. Now, the science behind it seems to be that it is in REM sleep that the tone of the muscles is completely gone. So, as he passes from slow wave sleep to REM sleep, the tone will drop. He'll not be able to hold the spoon anymore. The spoon will drop and he'll wake up during the dream. So, uh, that is how, and during that was the time when he used to get some bright ideas about what to paint. So, it seems that REM sleep continues to have a function, even in an adult, but the extent of this function becomes less because much of new learning, the movements don't have to be learned, growth has already taken place, and that's why it settles down at about 20%. But dream sleep still continues to be important, even in an adult. Now, the mechanism of sleep. The mechanism that was worked out in the 1930s uh, by, I think, uh, by Morozov and Magoon, I think. Yes. They did some experiments which on the basis of which they came up with a theory that sleep is primarily the reduction due to the reduction in sensory inputs. And this makes sense because we sleep best in a room which is relatively silent, neither too cold nor too hot, on a bed which is neither too soft nor too firm, and not too hard nor too soft, uh, which means try to minimize, and we lie down, which means no sensory inputs from the joints and muscles. So maximum sleep, we are most likely to sleep when there is very little sensory input. And what is the relationship between sensory inputs and staying awake or falling asleep? That seems to come from the non-specific pathways of the sensory inputs. The sensory inputs from the limbs or any part of the body, or whether it is visual stimuli from the eyes, they all have specific pathways by which they are conveyed to the brainstem and then to the thalamus, and from there to the cerebral cortex. It's at the cortical level that we become aware of the stimulus. We become aware that there is a stimulus, we become conscious of it. We know what is the modality of the stimulus, what type of stimulus it is. Is it a painful stimulus? Is it something warm? Is it something cold? Or is it some visual experience? So we become aware of this at the cortical level. And for that, there's a specific pathway, and there is a particular part in the sensory cortex which is dedicated to that part of the body. The face and the in the primary sensory cortex, the face being below and the legs being up. So it's an upside down representation. So it is that is where we know the type of stimulus it is, and therefore, because of this topographic representation, we also know where in the body this stimulus has been applied. But then along with this specific pathway, which gives specific information about the type of stimulus, the location of the stimulus, and from there further leads on to the emotional response to the stimulus and what we should do in response to that stimulus. In addition to this specific pathway, it seems that every sensory stimulus also has a non-specific pathway, which means that through this non-specific pathway, what happens is that irrespective of what type of stimulus it is, there is some activation of the entire cerebral cortex. So you can see a diffuse projection to the entire cerebral cortex uh, because of this non-specific pathway. And it is this diffuse projection, diffuse activation, widespread activation of the cerebral cortex, which is the part which is behind all conscious perception and voluntary activity. By keeping it active in a diffuse manner, irrespective of what sensory input it is, that we stay awake. And therefore, when we minimize the sensory inputs, this will go down, this diffuse projection will become less intense, and the result would be the person will start falling asleep. Now, this appeals to common sense and matches our experience, and therefore this theory uh, is still valid. But along with that, it was found that not only do we fall asleep through the passive process of the withdrawal of the uh, sensory inputs, but there are also areas which, when stimulated, actively induce sleep. So the induction of sleep not only a passive process because of the uh, withdrawal of sensory inputs, it's also because of something actively happening in some parts of the brain. So it's also an active process. And those areas are also now well identified. The neurotransmitters involved have been identified, and so on. So uh, sleep is partly a passive process which happens by default when the sensory inputs are reduced, but it's also an active process. Uh, some parts of the brain uh, become more active during this phase and apparently help us fall asleep. Then it is not, it seems apparently, only totally a neurological process. There are also some sleep producing substances, and they may be produced by the brain, but they don't utilize a particular specific pathway. Uh, but there are sleep producing substances, and the list is now growing, and it has become a very big list. We don't always know which part of the brain is producing them, whether they are entirely produced in the brain or some of them are being produced outside the brain. But there are sleep producing substances, whether they play a physiological role or some of them just capable of doing it, but they don't play a physiological role. All those things are uncertain, but they do have a large number of sleep producing substances which can also induce sleep. And one of the interesting sort of things which has come out from this is that one of such substance is interleukin 1. Interleukin 1 is a substance which is produced as a part of the immunological response. And the immunological response is to infections. And we find that when a person has an infection, the person actually feels more sleepy. And the this is a uh, beneficial because sleep has a restorative function. The person, if he spends more time sleeping, will heal better. So uh, we find that three responses, in fact, are tied up to the same substance, interleukin 1, which is part of the immune response. One of them is, of course, helping in the immune response itself. The other is that it induces fever. It raises the body temperature. And that also helps because all reactions in the body, they hasten when the temperature is a little higher. They take place at a higher rate. The rate of all chemical reactions in the body increases at a higher temperature. And that would include those chemical reactions which are required for healing. So a rise in the temperature is helpful in healing. The immune response is helpful in healing. And the induction of sleep by the same substance is also helpful in healing. And so we find the same substance doing it. Another interesting thing is that not only interleukin 1, which is a part of the immune response, does it, uh, sleep can be induced also by certain substances found in the bacterial wall, which means the germs themselves bring along with them a substance which is more likely to send us to sleep, perhaps even before the immune response has uh, actually taken proper shape. The bacteria themselves carry that with them. Whether the bacteria realize that they are helping us heal or not, it's difficult to say. But certainly, it seems a very uh, ingenious sort of way of way the body has been designed that we get some of the remedy in the very germ that is entering the body. Not only it is carrying a label on its body which will help us come up with with an immune response, it is also carrying substances which will help us sleep a little longer, which will help in healing. So there are sleep producing substances. So these are at least three types of mechanisms by which we sleep. And this story is still far from complete because we do not always know which part of the brain produces which neurotransmitter, and then which part of the brain in turn that neurotransmitter affects. So that whole chain is not complete. In some cases, we know the structures involved, but we don't know the neurotransmitters. In some cases, we know the neurotransmitters, but the neurotransmitter is in search of the structure in the brain from which it is produced. Uh, this field is still a developing field, but all the same, these are some of the sort of giving you some hints of the type of uh, ideas that we have about how we fall asleep. But then one thing which uh, sort of defies many of these things, a lot of this knowledge, is that uh, one person may be sleeping in a very comfortable room, has a comfortable bed, all the conditions for proper sleep have been met, and still the person is not able to fall asleep. Another person falls asleep quickly, also on the railway platform. Now, all this does not explain how that happens. One thing which seems to be important for falling asleep easily is hard work. This person who's sleeping on the platform probably worked hard throughout the day. So hard work during the day facilitates sleeping at night. Another thing which I think helps is a clear conscience. So if the person has a clear conscience, is mentally at peace, and has worked hard during the day, the person is likely to fall asleep easily. The Mandukya Upanishad talks about a fourth state of consciousness. Jagrat is the awake state. Supta is the dreamless sleep state. Swapna is the dream phase of the sleep. But it talks also of a fourth phase, that is Turiya. Now, what is Turiya? Now, if you look at these different phases of sleep, during the Jagrat phase, we are awake and involved, and the stimuli evoke emotional responses. Some of them make us happy, some of them not so happy. So we associate, we find some experience pleasant and some experience unpleasant. And all these experiences become possible because we are awake and alert and aware. So it's a phase of awareness, which also brings along with it pleasant and unpleasant experiences, and therefore joy and sorrow. When we are in the dreamless phase of sleep, we are not aware, the awareness is gone, and therefore there's nothing pleasant or unpleasant. We are in a state of perfect equanimity. Swapnavastha, or the dream phase, is a bit like the Jagrat phase in the sense that we are aware of the dream, and therefore there may be emotional responses to the dream. We get involved in the dream, although in the ordinary terms we might say it's not real, nothing is actually happening, but still we do get involved in the dream, and therefore it does give an emotional response. Now, Turiya combines some phases, some aspects of the awareness phase and some of the supta, which means that there is an awareness and yet the person has perfect equanimity. So it combines awareness with complete equanimity. Awareness comparable to that of the Jagrat phase, and lack of any emotional response, perfect equanimity of the Susupti or the Supta stage or the sleeping, dreamless sleep phase. But then how can that be possible? That is possible because the awareness of the Turiya is much higher, wider, and deeper than of the Jagrat state. Our ordinary Jagrat awake state is awake to only a small fraction of the total reality. Whereas in the Turiya state, the person has a much higher, wider, and deeper awareness, which is the type of awareness which the Rishi or the mystic has. Now, with that type of awareness, nothing seems to matter, and therefore he can have the perfect equanimity of the sleep stage. So that is one simple way to understand what Turiya is, the fourth state of consciousness. That is the mystic consciousness, the consciousness of the Rishi or the mystic, who has such a wide, deep, and high awareness that is aware of the total picture. Total picture would mean the total picture and the in-depth picture. Total picture, that this entire creation is much wider than me myself. So the expansion of the ego, breakdown of the ego boundaries, and the type of image that the individual has of being just one little drop in a great ocean, and the individuality of that drop is there, and yet it is not matter, does not matter, because the ocean will survive whether this drop is there or not. Whether the drop maintains its identity or loses its identity will not make any difference to the ocean. So it is that type of awareness which minimizes or eliminates the significance of all those things which we consider to be pleasant or unpleasant. Then within the type of reality that we see in the Jagrat phase, yes, this person can also see, but that does not affect this person, because to that person, these are all small little ripples in the ocean, and those ripples really don't matter, and therefore this person is not affected by what is happening to him. It's like something happening in a film or in the theater, in a drama, and that is what appears to this person, and that this person is not affected. So he has the equanimity of the sleep stage, the dreamless sleep stage, and the awareness which extends much beyond the awareness of the ordinary Jagrat or awake state. Now we turn to the other topic, and that is learning. I found this very interesting quotation about learning. So just put it there. The capacity to learn is a gift from the divine. The ability to learn is a skill, needs effort, practice. One has to deliberately cultivate it. But the willingness to learn is a choice. Learning is a change. After learning something, the person is different from the way the person was before the person learned. So learning is a change, and this is the result of an experience. And what is the type of change? It may be a change in behavior. That is how the person behaves. It may be a change in performance, how well a person can do something. Or it's a change in potential, the type of abilities the person acquires, which may show up when there is a need, or what the person will eventually be able to achieve, uh, the extent to which the potential itself has changed. So a change which results from experience in behavior or performance or potential. And this change may be an outer change, or it may be an inner change. The inner change is the type of change that we talk about on the spiritual path or in the field of yoga. Uh, the inner change is much more important, because what is happening is that the person is developing a different uh, view of the world, a different view of life, a different view of the purpose of life. And uh, when the person is living a life which is in keeping with that broader vision of the the world view and the view of life that he now has, when he lives that, he experiences joy, which reinforces that type of a behavior. When he does not, then he feels a disturbance, which leads to an inner churning, and the person undergoes an inner change, because of which his subsequent behavior is likely to be more in keeping with this new worldview, this worldview which he has, which he's trying to live in his life. So it can be an inner change. So learning is basically uh, a change resulting from experience, and the type of change could take many forms, and the change also may be visible outside or may not be so visible on the outside. There are two broad types of learning. One is non-associative and the other associative. Non-associative learning is imitation. For example, a doctor learns surgery by watching another surgeon perform the surgery. So a lot of this is through imitation, by observing somebody else doing it. There's also associative learning. For example, we find that every time there are dark clouds, generally they are followed by rain. So the person builds up an association between dark clouds and rain, and therefore, even if it is not raining, if there are dark clouds in the sky, the person may carry an umbrella with him. So this is associative learning. We shall focus on only two experimental paradigms of associative learning in this session. One of them is what is called classical conditioning. It was studied by Pavlov, a Russian physiologist. Uh, if a dog is presented with a bone, and bone is something which is food for the dog and also food that the dog loves, uh, the mere sight of a palatable food increases the salivary secretion in the mouth. It makes the mouth water. And therefore, the mouths, the water starts dribbling from the mouth of this dog just on seeing the bone. This is an inbuilt reflex. This is a type of reflex with which we are born. We don't have to learn it. We are born with this type of a reflex. But then what he did was, uh, before presenting the bone to the dog, he started ringing a bell. So first he would ring the bell, and then after a few seconds, present the bone to the dog. Now, if this is repeated a few hundred times, hundreds of times, you first ring the bell, then give the bone. Ring the bell and then give the bone. If it is done a few hundred times, then if you only ring the bell, the mouth starts dribbling. That's because now the dog has started associating the sound of the bell with the presentation of the bone. And therefore, the mere ringing of the bell creates that expectation that now the bone is coming, and that stimulates this dribbling from the mouth. So now the stimulus is not the bone, but the bell. That has become the new stimulus which is able to give this. But this will happen up to a point. If every time you only ring the bell and now don't give the bone, this will again become extinct. It can become extinct also. It can disappear. But then even if you give the bone a few times after ringing the bell, this will persist. So this is what is called classical conditioning. The dog has been conditioned to expect a bone every time the bell is rung. So that is the type of conditioning the dog has. And a lot of our learning is of this type, in which we also get conditioned to expect something. So this is a picture of Pavlov, who studied this classical conditioning. And of course, there were so many variations which he made in this experiment, went on for years, and eventually ended up getting a Nobel Prize. Now, this is another type of conditioning, operant conditioning. This was studied by another experimental psychologist, Burrus Frederick Skinner. And after his name, this box that he constructed is called the Skinner box. Now, in this box, the arrangement is that we have a rat inside the box, of course, and then the arrangement is such that there is a lever. This is the lever. If the rat presses on this lever, what happens is that a pellet of food drops out from this food pellet dispenser, falls in this cup, and the rat can get a pellet of food. Of course, the water dispenser is there, which has no complicated arrangement, because the rat can have water whenever it likes. And here is the response counter. That is, you can count how many times the rat presses the lever. Now, initially, when you place the rat in the box, the rat just runs around, plays, and then accidentally it may hit the lever. And then it is pleasantly surprised with a thud. Thud is the thud because the pellet has fallen in this cup, and it gets the pellet and enjoys it. Initially, it may happen only accidentally, but then gradually it finds that every time it presses the lever, it gets some food. So it builds up an association between the pressing of the lever and the pellet that it gets as a reward. And the result is that it starts pressing the lever again and again at a feverish pace to get more and more pellets. And that's what this counter will record. So the frequency with which he presses the lever, goes up steeply after it has built up this association that every time I press the lever, I get some food. So the frequency goes up. Now, why it is called operant conditioning is because the rat has got conditioned to operate on the environment in such a way that it is rewarded. Lever is a part of his environment. He's operating on the environment in such a way that it gets rewarded. So, and that's why it's called operant conditioning. Now, this may look apparently a little similar to what we saw in classical conditioning, but there are a few important differences. And one of them is that here we are not making use of any inborn reflex. There we made use of an inborn reflex with which the a person is born. That is, when we are presented with some palatable food, the mouth starts watering. So that's an inborn reflex. It doesn't have to be learned. It's, uh, it's a classical reflex, which is inborn. Here, there is no such inborn reflex involved. Secondly, in that case, the animal was completely passive. The investigator decided when to present the bone, when to ring the bell, and so on. Here, the rat is actually participating in the experiment in a way. The rat is not passive, it is actively pressing the lever to get the reward. So, this is something which is a little closer to human learning in a way, because we gradually learn to operate on the environment or behave in such a way that rewards will be maximized. Not only the rewards are maximized, but punishment minimized. And that type of experiments also Skinner did. Instead of getting food, every time it would press a lever, it would get an electric shock. And the rat also learned that gradually, that and started associating the pressing of the lever with an electric shock, and then it started avoiding pressing the lever. So we learn to behave in a way that will maximize reward and minimize punishment. For example, a married person gradually learns what the partner likes and what the partner does not like, and gradually starts behaving in a way that will maximize or increase that type of behavior which pleases the partner and minimize that type of behavior which is likely to annoy the partner. So that is how learning can take place. And Skinner was not only a psychologist, he was also a social reformer. He said that if this is the basis of learning, then it's better to have a society which is based on learning through reward than through punishment, which means you provide incentive for learning rather than punishment for a crime. So you provide an incentive for doing the right thing instead of punishing a crime. In school, you provide incentive to the child rather than punishment for not doing something properly. And this is something which actually is used a lot by the child himself, because the child knows that if I finish my homework, then I will be rewarded. If I don't finish the homework, I may be punished. So the child tries to finish the homework before going to school the next day. In a game, if I follow the rules, I'll continue to play. If I do not follow the rules, nobody will play with me. So these are things, which one associates through association, we learn. So a lot of human learning does take place through the type of process that Skinner came up with, and he may have exaggerated it a bit, that all learning is happening through this. But then basically his intention was good, and his aim was that schools, education, and society as a whole should be built more on the principle of rewarding what is right rather than punishing what is wrong. So that is the type of society we should have. Another thing that he did was that instead of the rat getting a food pellet every time it pressed the lever, he also did experiments in which the rat will not get it every time, but say every alternate time. So once it will get the food, at once it will not. Still, the rat will continue to press, and it will gradually master that this time I'll get it, this time I will not get it. So this is a regular, predictable schedule of reinforcement. Getting a reward is a type of reinforcement. So it's a regular, predictable schedule of reinforcement, not every time, but every alternate time. Then, you can increase the interval. Not every time, not every alternate time, but once in 3 times. So press the lever thrice, out of that once you will get. But again, regular and predictable. Then it can be made also irregular and unpredictable. You press it, sometimes one may get, sometimes we not got. On an average, it may be once in 3 times or once in 4 times, but it is not, say if it is once in 4 times, it is not essential that the pellet should come during the first press or the second or the third or the fourth. It could come either during the first or the second or the third or the fourth. So one goes on making it irregular at random. But all the same, on an average, out of 4 presses, the rat gets it at least once. Now, if one goes on increasing this ratio further, so that the rat will get it only once out of 25 times, then we find that the rat starts behaving like a neurotic. It goes crazy. And that's sort of, again, something which it tells us that how some of the mental illnesses might result. So this what might make a person also neurotic. The person goes on trying for something and does not succeed, and what can happen as a result of that. These days, there are some very stiff competitive exams, and students go on trying for them 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. If they don't succeed the first time, that is something like the rat going on pressing and not actually getting the pellet, getting it occasionally and in an unpredictable way. So that drove the rat crazy. So a lot of things came out from this type of experiments. One basic mechanism of learning, that is learning behavior, learning to display a type of behavior which leads to reward and which avoids punishment. That was learned through this. And then that gave us ideas about how it can be applied in education and in the society. So they were useful experiments, but all the same, people were not very happy with him. Some people had strong reservations about being compared to rats, and therefore he was a controversial psychologist, but all the same, he ended up giving some useful bit of knowledge based on experimental evidence. Now, how do Skinner's findings reconcile with the Gita? Now, in the Gita, one of the best known verses is Karmanye vadhikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana. You are entitled to action, but not to the fruit. Now, here his theory is based entirely on action motivated by the fruit of a reward. Now, here we are told that you can perform the action, but don't be attached to the fruit. Now, here there's a little subtle thing that we have to notice, that the Gita nowhere says that you should not expect a fruit or a favorable outcome from your actions. Any intelligent person, when he does something, starts thinking that if I do something, say if my action is A, the consequences will be B. This is a calculation based on reasoning, based on logic, based on what normally happens as a result of doing something. So action A is likely to lead to consequence B, and that consequence B is a reward, and therefore I engage in action A, which means that consequence B will be a pleasing, pleasant experience. I can consider it a reward, and that's why I indulge in this action. The Gita does not prevent us from getting into that type of a calculation or that type of an expectation. What the Gita says is that do not be attached to the fruit. Do not insist on the fruit, which means be prepared for the fruit to be quite different from what you expected. That's all what the Gita says. And that can happen, because in the real world, my calculation may be that action A will lead to consequence B, which will be pleasant, but actually my action A may not lead to B. It may either lead to something which is neutral or to which I can remain indifferent, or it may lead to something which makes me distinctly displeased. It may lead to an unpleasant consequence. The consequences may be just the opposite from what I had expected. Or it may be only part of the expectation is fulfilled, not the whole. For example, Gandhiji wanted the country to be free. The country became free, but it was divided, which is something which he did not want. And so the consequences may not fully satisfy my expectations, which means that in the real world, the type of reinforcement we get is unpredictable. The schedule of reinforcement is of the irregular variety, intermittent and irregular. It doesn't come every time after the action. Every action is not rewarded, and which action will be rewarded follows a very irregular schedule. The way it was in the case of the rats, that it could be on an average once in 4 times, but one doesn't know whether it will be the first press, second press, or the third press, or the fourth press, which will get the food pellet. So here also, in the real world also, it is random, unpredictable reinforcement. Now, what does the attitude of the Gita do? What the attitude of the Gita does is that it takes away that insistence, that attachment on the outcome, which may make the uh, outcome unpleasant to us. If it does not lead to the expected reward, we feel that we will feel upset. Or if the outcome is just the opposite of what we expected, we may be upset. But what the Gita tells us is that you do not have to insist on the uh, outcome, because you are not the doer. You are only an instrument for carrying out the mission, because you have been chosen as an instrument by the divine. So you are an instrument, you are not the doer. If you're not the doer, you cannot insist on the reward or the outcome. The outcome can be quite different from what you had expected. And not only that, we also learn through the Gita and on the spiritual path in general that irrespective of the outcome, whatever the outcome may be, the one which I expected or I did not expect, every outcome only creates a certain type of situation. It leads to certain circumstances. And all circumstances can be used for spiritual growth, which is the very purpose of life. And therefore, even if the outcome is traumatic, instead of being rewarding the way I had expected, that traumatic experience also becomes a means for further spiritual growth. So, in other words, what the attitude of the Gita does is to convert an erratic, unpredictable, intermittent, irregular schedule into a perfectly predictable, regular, consistent schedule, which means no matter what the outcome, that outcome can be treated as a reward. So, in fact, we are still in a way working for the reward, and the reward which the spiritual seeker is working for is joy and lasting mental peace. And that is something which is guaranteed 100% of the time with the type of attitude that the Gita inculcates. So, actually, it's not that the spiritual seeker does not want to be happy. It's just that the yardstick has changed. And therefore, irrespective of the outcome, the spiritual seeker can be happy, can be in a happy state, and can go on engaging in action and deal with every outcome with perfect equanimity. Let me end with a quote from the mother. Let all circumstances, all happenings in life be occasions constantly renewed for learning more and ever more. We can learn from everything, all events, all circumstances, all occasions, all individuals, not only all people, but also from animals and plants. Even an ant can teach us so much about hard work, discipline, and so on. So let everything be a source of learning for us. Suggested reading uh, these two textbooks, Fundamentals of Physiology and Understanding Medical Physiology. And this is a place to which you're always welcome, Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. For any questions or comments, please write us on yes@yesspirituality.com. Gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for making these sessions possible. And thank you all for listening and watching.
Namaste, Bhaiya.
Namaste,
Gratitude
Anand.
for a wonderful session, and you covered some very fascinating topics today. My question is about modern medicine and how much of it is. I mean, it's kind of a subjective conversation, but how much of it is classical and operant conditioning and collective suggestions of irrational fears and risks, and even a lot of herd mentality. Because you talked about mechanism of sleep, and you talked about sleep producing substances and natural immunity. And now we see this obsession with medicine, and we have this dependence on sleep inducing substances like sleeping pills and artificial immunity every time there's a slight infection. And even during this COVID times, we saw that in a lot of countries there was a very strict compulsory vaccination drive, even going on right now in China, for example. So, uh, what are your thoughts on this? And um, is it kind of become a mechanical unconscious habit more often than not, that our default go-to mode becomes towards medicines? And how much of yoga and rise in consciousness can, I mean, we all know it will, but if you could share that too, based on your own experience around natural immunity and so on. Thank you.
Well, that's a very good comment because modern medicine has made us uh, dependent on it, and that is because of conditioning. We have started feeling that if there is any symptom, then I must go to a doctor, I must take a pill. That is something which is human learning, you might say. No animal does any such thing, and still the animals too keep getting all right on their own. We also have those same latent abilities, but some of those abilities have perhaps been lost actually because of this type of conditioning that we have developed. And this is something which you can say is operant conditioning, not classical, because to turn to a doctor or to uh, turn to a pill is not an inbuilt inborn reflex. It is something which we pick up as we grow up, and therefore we find that even a small child, when uh, told, when sort of the child has something, the child expects that now is some medicine will be given, and then I'll be all right. So the child develops this association between the medicine and getting well, not between the intrinsic capacity of the body to self heal and getting well. I mean, once my granddaughter had a skin rash, and I asked her after a few days how she was. She says, "It's all right." How did it become all right? Because I applied an ointment to it. Now, this association you develop early in childhood, that application of the ointment makes the skin heal. We forget that the skin also has self healing mechanisms of its own. The skin may assist them, may hasten them, accelerate them, but basically, it's your inbuilt mechanism which will ultimately heal, not the medicine.
I sorry, I was on mute. Um, how does mantra play a role in with sleep? A lot of times when you even if you have had a rough day or you worked out, um, you don't probably get a good sleep, and then sometimes chanting mantras help. Can you please elaborate or talk about it? The effects of chanting mantra to get a good sleep.
Yes, I mean, uh, if one does not normally fall asleep in the usual way, there are many things one can do. And certainly one of the things one can do is to chant a mantra, which is a sort of a prayer for us. That makes us feel connected to a higher source. Because if we really look at the creation of the mantras are not ordinary poems or verses which were written by the rishis. The mantras came to them from a higher source. And and therefore they have a certain mantric power in them. And depending upon how much we are also able to connect with that higher source while chanting the mantra, it becomes more and more effective and giving us that same wider awareness, and along with that, a perfect equanimity, which is a good background for falling asleep. So it can help, certainly. And we did not really go into today into every aspect of sleep, what to do when one finds it difficult to fall asleep, etc. That will come in the next course, yes.04, where we'll talk about lifestyle diseases. We'll once again talk about sleep because sleeping well is becoming more and more rare. Chronic voluntary sleep deprivation is emerging as a major lifestyle factor for several lifestyle diseases. And if a person finds it difficult to fall asleep, what all a person can do is important. And mantra is certainly one of those things which one can do. Apart from, of course, any general prayer, mantra is a special type of prayer, but then the effect also depends. The effect of the mantra would depend upon uh, whether it is done in a mechanical way, with understanding, with a conscious effort to connect to a higher source. So all these things will gradually go on increasing the power of the mantra.
Thank you.
All right, if we don't have any more questions, we close today's session with a moment of silence. Thank you everyone for joining in.